Midsommar was written and directed by Aster and stars Florence Pugh as Dani, a woman who goes with her boyfriend to a fabled festival in Sweden. She's recovering from a recent tragedy, and so this sounds like a great way to unwind. But eventually, the locals begin to show their true colors as their practices get increasingly more disturbing. My trip to see this film was interesting. On the road, I noticed that this storm cloud is hovering over the exact area of the theater. So naturally, that was rather terrifying to see, and before I even get to the theater, I find myself trapped in this. I was excited to see this movie. I was not even going to let an actual flood stop me. It's safe to say this was top 5 most anticipated films of the year for me. Hereditary was my all-time favorite movie of last year. I adored that film. When I saw it, I was floored. I was consistently entertained. I was impressed. On opening weekend, I got together tons of people to come and see it with me because I wanted to share it with them, and none of them liked it. It was a very polarizing film for audiences, which is one of the things I loved about it. And in the case of Midsommar, I fear it will be even more divisive. This film is going to turn off a lot of viewers due to some of its content, its slow pace, its 140-minute runtime, and the fact that it takes a while for anything to quote-unquote happen. It's an hour in before we get our first disturbing cult moment. For a long time, it just seems like a bunch of folks who like to hang out in the woods and get high. And so the film drags, without a doubt, despite how beautiful this movie is shot. The cinematography is off the charts gorgeous. The color palette is so beautiful and sublime. Just looking at this movie is a treat for your eyes. Narratively, though, the film is a bit slight. The first 20 minutes provide a setup that's rarely ever explored again or even referenced throughout the film. And it's a very complex setup for what happens to Dani's family in the first 20 minutes of the movie. I won't get into it, even though I don't really consider it a spoiler because it all occurs before the title cards even come up. But it's the kind of thing that you expect an explanation for or some kind of connection to the narrative, because the film has a few major themes, 2 of which are grief and how we process it, and dealing with a terrible relationship that isn't necessarily toxic in the way that movies tend to portray them, but perhaps is just not really doing anything good for either parties. But they're looking for an excuse to get out of it, but they don't have that excuse yet, and how we as people deal with that kind of relationship. And this film explores the relationship themes much better than it does the grief themes. Hereditary also had a lot to say about how we process grief, and it did it excellently, I feel. This film doesn't have those strengths, because it seemed like the film forgot about its setup and used it specifically as a device to make us care about Florence Pugh's character, who, by the way, is terrific in this movie. She's mesmerizing. The best performance I've ever seen her give. She's truly amazing in this film. Also, the editing in particular is immaculate. The cuts are extremely impressive. Technically, from a presentation perspective, what you see and what you hear, this movie has everything it needs to be a great film. I found the story not as investing as I hoped it would have been, because it felt very similar to a few other films, namely the original 1970s The Wicker Man. That film has a lot of similarities to this. Both of them open with a woman singing, sort of like a chanting tune. Both of them feature people dancing in circles around a tree-like object, nude women singing and dancing in some sort of sexual procession, and of course the entire idea of a fish-out-of-water scenario where someone is stuck in some weird pagan cult and a bunch of horrible shit is going down. There's even a bear suit in this movie, which Nicolas Cage so perfected in his version of The Wicker Man. And so there's just a lot in this movie that I kept seeing, and it started to surprise me, the similarities to other films. One that came out in 2003 that's actually called Midsommar, that is about a character whose sister commits suicide, and in his grief, he goes with some friends to Sweden for a midsummer retreat, and a bunch of fucked up shit happens. And both male leads in the separate films share the same name of Christian. This could be a complete coincidence, or maybe Aster is just trolling all of us because he's aware of the similarities and he's having fun with them. I'm not saying anybody ripped off anything. Please don't misquote me. I'm just saying I noticed. But despite some issues I have with the narrative and some similarities to other films, there's something about it that definitely draws you in. And there are some insanely gorgeous moments that I will never forget, namely a shot that features Florence Pugh and a lot of flowers in a really beautiful wide that was just absolutely stunning. But still, there's a part of the movie that felt cold to me. It didn't really invest me. The characters felt kind of like objects and less like people. It does have a lot of comedy in it as well, with some sequences that are absolutely meant to be funny, namely Will Poulter's character, who provides a lot of comedic relief. But this film is being marketed as a horror film, and in some ways it is, and in some ways it's not. It seems they made an attempt to hide a lot of the more horrific elements and have those things happen off screen, which creates a sense of disorientation for the lead characters and for the viewer. And since they spend half of this movie high, disorientation is definitely a goal, I think. But I would have loved to have known a little bit more about what happens behind the scenes. There's a lot of things you can learn if you look at the background set dressing and the production design, drawings and artistic renderings of elements of the story, things you have to actually pay attention to, which is cool and fun, especially on a second viewing, because you can kind of learn more about the movie. I struggle to understand exactly what the first 20 minutes has to do with the rest of the movie, except for the themes of grief. It was such a complex way for some of the things that happen to her family to happen, with very little explanation, that since it's never really discussed again, it feels like an unnecessary setup. This is a very simple story, but it's elevated. It's an elevated approach to an extremely simple story, and so it makes it feel bigger and broader than the story confines actually are. At its core, this is a movie about some friends who stumble across a creepy cult, get high, and some fucked up shit happens. But it's taken to this really extreme level that's going to make a lot of people get really excited. And it's just weird, I know, coming from me because of how much I loved Hereditary, but this to me was a disappointment because it achieves a similar feeling of being unsettled and excellent performances, but this film's attempt at its themes just didn't quite hit home for me. But I can still recommend that you see it because it's a film made by somebody with a vision, despite the fact that it is very self-indulgent and highly pretentious. It's a film that I think people should see, especially if you want to be involved in filmmaking, because looking at the craft on display, you're going to see a masterwork in just about every aspect. But to me, the most important part was sort of forgotten about: telling a compelling story. I'm going to give Midsommar a B-. Trust me, I wanted to walk out of that theater and say this was the best movie of 2019, but for me, I found a lot of things that concern me, but still, I will be at Ari Aster's next film. I mean, I will be there on day one, and I will see it because this is a filmmaker with a vision, and it's somebody who's trying to do something different, and I respect that. So I'm excited to see what he does next. Guys, thank you so much, as always, for watching. Look forward to more reviews very soon, and if you like this, you can click right here and get Stuckmanized.